Good morning, afternoon, or evening for everyone who's joined us, depending upon where you are in the world. We are really happy to have you with us today. As I noted, this event is being recorded. And my name is Emily Loeb, and I'm the Director of Programs and Education at the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. The Holocaust Center connects the horrors of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism with injustices of today. And through education, we seek to address these injustices and empower individuals to build a more civil and humane society. If you are joining the Holocaust Center for the first time, welcome. We support schools, teachers, and organize various public events, both in person and remotely. We've provided a link to our event page in the chat, so please make sure to check that. You are joining us today for one of our 2 annual International Holocaust Remembrance Day programs. Our next event is on Tuesday, January 31st, here in Pittsburgh at Riverstone Books on Forbes Avenue. And we will be joined by Joanna Sleva and Elizabeth White, who will be talking about their book, Counterfeit Countess, which tells the unknown story of a Jewish woman who rescued more than 10,000 Poles imprisoned by Poland's Nazi occupiers. For our International Holocaust Remembrance Day programs, we endeavor to create programs that center on non-Jewish victim groups or lesser told stories. I should note we're actually joined today with by Jake Newsom, who was presented last year about his research and book, Pink Triangles. So welcome, Jake. Today, we are excited to host Dr. Robbie Aitken. Dr. Aitken is a historian of Black Europe, and his research and teaching interests include the history of Black diaspora in Germany, European colonialism, and the constructions of race in pre-1945 Europe. His current research focuses on the Black experience of Nazi Germany, as well as post-war compensation claims made by Black victims. He's also worked on a number of museum and memorialization projects in Germany and has developed a traveling expedition. He's a book review editor for H Black Europe and is an active contributor to the website Black Central Europe. So for today, Dr. Aitken will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we'll head into questions and answers for about another half an hour or so. If you have questions during the lecture, please feel free to submit them in the chat and we will consolidate them. And after Dr. Aitken answers those questions, we'll have time, hopefully we'll have some time for some additional questions. So we are honored to have Dr. Aitken with us. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to him.
So thank you so much for such a kind introduction. I am very grateful, Emily, for this invitation to be involved in this event marking Holocaust Memorial Day, and for the opportunity to talk about aspects of my research into Black German history, really into a central and crucial aspect of my research, and that's namely the Black experience of Nazi Germany. I'm going to begin with an image of some of the kind of things that some of you might actually have seen before. These are Stolpersteine, stumbling stones, cobblestone memorials to victims of the Nazi regime, which you can find in many towns and cities across Europe. In particular, of course, you will find them in Germany. And in front of you, you can see 9 dedicated to Black victims and 2 to their white partners, which were laid in Berlin over the course of last year, and which I was fortunate to work on with a couple of civil society organizations, ESD, the Initiative of Black People in Germany, and Die Koloniale, as well as the City Museum Berlin-Schöneberg. At the beginning of last year, there were over 100,000 Stolpersteine across Europe. The memorials that you can see here brought the number dedicated to Black victims to 15 out of over 100,000. So for the purposes of my talk, I wanted to open with the memorials to make several general starting points. Firstly, Black people were most certainly victims of the Nazis. To my mind, there is clear documentary evidence that they were targeted individually and also collectively by the regime at a national level by leading Nazis, but also at a local level by party members and by fanatics. Secondly, Black people's experiences were diverse. Those whose life stories are commemorated here include people who, among other things, were sent to concentration camps, were institutionalized, were forced to flee, were excluded from school and from employment, and subjected to physical and verbal abuse on a day-to-day basis. The third point I want to make is that the scarcity of public memorials to Black victims really reflects the fact that Black people remain almost entirely absent from public and historical memory of the Holocaust. They are in many ways forgotten victims of the Nazi terror, a term which was used from the 1980s onwards to describe a diverse range of groups, such as the Sinti and Roma, the disabled, gay victims, foreign forced laborers, whose persecution at the hands of the Nazis remained largely unrecognized until recently. Already in the 1990s, though, Robert Kesting, the late archivist at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, applied this phrase, forgotten victims, to men and women of African heritage. But while there's been belated political and public acknowledgement of the sufferings these former groups experienced, Black people are not officially recognized as victims of Nazi persecution. Indeed, I think we can go further and say that to a large degree, they've been written out not simply of the history of the Holocaust, but also of larger narratives and stories of European history in general and German history specifically. I'd be really interested to hear how many of you were aware that a small, diverse Black community existed in Germany already pre-1914, and that a Black presence in German-speaking Europe can actually be traced at least as far back as the 1200s, and perhaps even further back to Roman times. This invisibility has serious consequences for the contemporary Black presence in Germany. It feeds into a persistent belief that Blackness and Germanness are mutually exclusive categories, as well into a distorted perception that a Black population in Germany only begins in 1945 with the stationing of African American soldiers in post-war West Germany. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do over the course of the next 45 minutes or so is to introduce you to this forgotten Black presence and to make a clear case for the fact that Black people were victims of the Nazi regime, that they were subjected to policies and practices of exclusion, which contained at least the germs of a progressively racial annihilationism. So in other words, that there was a genocidal intent in the Nazis' actions towards Black people. I'll start by making a few comments about the makeup and the size of the Black population in Germany, just to make clear who it is that I'm talking about. Then I'll turn to look at Nazi racial policy, the Nazis' vision of German society, and early forms of social and political exclusion which Black people were subjected to. In particular, I want to say something about their legal status and citizenship or lack of. Next, I'll discuss the Nuremberg race laws of 1935 and how they were applied to Black people, really a key moment in marginalization. Very briefly, I'll discuss safe spaces, which opened up as a result of German hopes of regaining their lost African colonies. I'll finish by turning to the outbreak of World War II, when as Europe's Jews and Sinti and Roma were targeted for annihilation, we also see an escalation of violence towards Black people. So let's turn to Germany's Black population. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, the Black presence is small, but it's very visible. Contemporary reports suggested that Black residents numbered as many as 3,000, a figure that's maybe on the high side. Broadly speaking, though, this resident population can be split into two quite separate groups, which I'll come to. In addition, there's a floating population of African Americans, predominantly performers or sports people, a floating population of men and women from the likes of Liberia, who we can't say are settled in Germany. So we're going to focus on what I would call a resident population, people who are living there, who are setting up lives. The first group that I'll say a little bit about, but not too much, are the so-called Rhineland children. These are the some 500 to 800 children who were born to German women and French colonial soldiers who were part of the French Rhineland occupation in the aftermath of World War I. So under the terms of the post-war peace, the French will station troops, including soldiers from West and North Africa and Asia, in this important industrial region during the 1920s. The children who are born out of these mixed relationships that develop actually live largely in isolation from other Black residents. I'm going to return to them later, though, because I think that Nazi policy towards them informs Nazi policy towards all of African heritage. And as the newspaper article on the left from 1936 demonstrates, the Nazis were well aware of these children's existence. I'm going to focus more, though, on a second group that's dominated by men from Germany's former African colonies, the vast majority of whom arrived in Germany before World War I, who come for a wide variety of reasons, and I'm also going to include their German-born children and grandchildren. So we need to just very briefly return to the pre-1914, pre-World War I period. Because from the 1880s, when Germany seizes its colonies up to 1914, we have several thousand Black men, a small number of Black women spending time in Germany. They come from all regions of Africa, as well as from the Caribbean, South America, and the United States. Many are coming from Germany's colonies. And you can see them marked in blue. So I'm talking about Togo. I'm thinking also about German East Africa, that's parts of Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda. To a far lesser extent, I'm thinking about German Southwest Africa, that's present-day Namibia. Above all, however, I'm thinking about men and boys who are coming from Cameroonian coastal towns, especially from the influential city of Douala. So pre-1914, this is a mobile population. People are coming and going. Most are not staying long-term. It's the war and the subsequent Versailles peace settlement which will really transform Germany's Black population and its potential for growth. Germany is stripped of its colonies, and this brings an end to a continuous in-migration from the now former colonies, and indeed from most of Africa. The German colonies and their populations are placed under what's called mandate protection, primarily of the British and the French. Effectively, both states run their mandates as colonies. And I'll come back to what that means for people in Germany. At the same time, at the end of the war, all Black men, all Black people who are unable to get out of Germany in 1914 before the fighting starts are stuck there for the war, and they're effectively stranded there in the post-war period with little or no hope of returning home. So, in 1933, when the Nazis come to power, there are still several hundred men from the former colonies, mostly from Cameroon, some from Togo, a few from Tanzania, maybe 2 from Namibia, and a few from other countries like Liberia, South Africa, Abyssinia, and men and women from the Caribbean and the US. They form the bulk of this resident community. By this time, many have set down roots, and it's a male-dominated population. So that means they've married German women and they've started families. You can see a couple of examples of families here in the image. On the left-hand side, you can see the Cameroonian Mandenga Dik with his family in Danzig, Gdansk, in present-day Poland, a successful trader of colonial goods for a long time period. On the right-hand side, you can see another Cameroonian from a different part of Cameroon. This is Theophilus Vonia Michael and his family living in Berlin in the 1920s. This is Theophilus with his second wife and 4 of his children. So in all, I'd say that this second group that we're focusing on, we're talking about maybe 1,500 to 2,000 Black residents. It is a population that's primarily based in Germany's 2 biggest cities, Berlin and Hamburg. But there are families also living in other towns like Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Hanover, Dresden, Leipzig, Munich. It's a population which has established friendship social and political networks that extend throughout Germany, we can talk of a Black community. Many Black people know one another, they live close to one another, they socialize with another. We're beginning to see the development of Black social spaces in Berlin and Hamburg pre-1933. And the image here, I think, speaks partly to those networks and those social networks. We can see men of the first generation from Cameroon and Togo alongside their German-born children, and as well as a North African as well on a night out. Not only are they linked within Germany, they're also linked to Black diasporic groups elsewhere in Europe and beyond, particularly to France, but also to the United States and to their African homelands. Significantly, members of this community up to 1933 have been vocal and active in national and international protests against racism and colonial abuse, something that's brought to a shuddering halt in 1933. But even before the Nazis come to power, they are beginning to face increasing marginalization. And that's in the context of a global economic depression in the late 1920s, which leads to high rates of unemployment. And of course, in the context of a rise of racial intolerance. Many are struggling to find work. Most earn at best a precarious living as performers. A real exception, though, is the man you can see in front of you. This is the Cameroonian performer Bibi Mpisa, who's better known as Louis Brody, an activist, an actor, a singer, a star of stage and screen, who really sustains a career right up into the 1940s. Despite the small numbers, Black people were clearly highly visible in the cities in which they lived. And as we'll see, the upper echelons of the Nazi regime showed a really unhealthy interest in their fates. Well, excuse me while my... Apologies for that. Let's turn to Nazi racial policy, though. What was the Nazis' vision of society? When they seized power in January 1933, the Nazis sought to construct their Volksgemeinschaft, their so-called people's community. And this was to be a racial utopia, where purity of blood and a concept of race would become key factors in determining who belongs. Those who were deemed to be racial aliens, undesirable or unfit on account of their supposed racial and or genetic makeup were to be excluded from this new Germany in development. And as we'll see, they were to be prevented from having children. It is important to make clear from the outset that it's Europe's Jews who are at the forefront of the Nazis' racial policies. And actually, very few pieces of legislation specifically referred to Black people, something that would be pointed to post-1945 to downplay the regime's treatment of them. But such as the elasticity, the flexibility of the regime's racial laws, the policies and practices of exclusion and persecution directed against Jews in particular, and racial aliens in general, they could very easily be applied to other groups, including Black men and women. And there's clear evidence that this was the case. It is difficult to talk about common experiences, but while individual experiences varied, they were clearly contextual. Without doubt, the Nazi seizure of power greatly impacted on the lives of all Black people in Germany, and it has been remembered by members of the community as a watershed moment in their personal histories. Josie Allen, who we can see here looking towards the camera, and whose father was actually from Liverpool, of Caribbean heritage, she spoke of her experiences immediately at the end of the war in 1945. She said, "Berlin was fine until Hitler came. After Hitler came, colored people began dropping out of sight. Many went to concentration camps, never to return." Among those never to return was one of Josie's brothers, Ferdinand, who was murdered in 1941 as part of the Nazis' euthanasia program. Another brother, Robert, was shot as a member of the resistance in Warsaw in 1945. The comments of Louisa Masipo, wife of a Cameroonian man from 1958, provide brief but more details of her family's experiences in Frankfurt in the mid-1930s. I quote, "It was impossible to be seen with my husband, whether on the street, in a pub, or in the theatre, without being subjected to verbal abuse. When I went out for walks with our child, members of the SA spat on the poor boy, and I, as a mother, had to look on without being able to do anything about it. The Masipos fled to France in 1937. Dorothea Dieck, daughter of Mandenga, who we saw earlier, she simply concluded the Adolf term was the worst that anyone can imagine. Indeed, within weeks of taking power, the Nazis had created an atmosphere in which people were free and encouraged to express racial prejudice. Consequently, in several localities, individual Black residents and their families were targeted and victimized by party fanatics and hangers-on. Already in June 1933, the performer and activist Harius Gilges, you can see here, he was brutally murdered by a mob of local Nazi officials and supporters in Düsseldorf. In Berlin, a handful of families were simply forced out of their homes to wait for Nazi supporters, while others lost their livelihood as traders and performers because of local protests, including Mandenga Dieck, who we saw living in Gdansk. Victimization extended to their children, who would be exposed to racial abuse at school and who were liable to be humiliated during racial science and biology lessons. Almost without exception, their education will be prematurely ended with the Nazification of the school system, once party members and supporters infiltrate the education system. Denied access to education, they're subsequently also frequently unable to secure apprenticeships and employment. Many will, by default, become performers like their parents. But they and their parents, too, will struggle to find work because of discriminatory legislation that's introduced at a national level and directed primarily against Jews and or racial aliens in general, that's then applied to them. So in particular, the exclusion of non-Aryans from German mainstream cultural life will impact upon Black residents, the majority of whom are earning a living as performers. Soon, they're no longer allowed to perform in public. This renders most unemployed, and side product, it increasingly restricts the ability of touring African-American performers to appear in Germany. It's not a surprise then, I think, that several families and individuals flee Germany. But leaving is not easy. Our first important legal step in the process of marginalizing Black people, particularly those from the former colonies, begins within months of the change of the regime. I think it's important to know that already before the turn of the century in Germany, if you were a resident there, you needed to be able to provide evidence of your identity or your citizenship upon request. For many within the Black community, this has long been an issue because those in the colonies were never German citizens. They were colonial subjects with very unclear and limited rights in Germany. The German authorities never foresaw that there would be a permanent Black community. Now, of course, once Germany stripped of its colonies after the war, now they are simply former colonial subjects with even fewer and more ambiguous rights. In theory, according to the Versailles Peace Settlement, they are under the legal protection of the Mandate Powers, which, as we said, foremost France and Britain. But neither state shows much interest in taking up this responsibility, and they are certainly not interested in allowing Black men to return home, especially if they have white wives and children. So in effect, we can use this term nobody's people that was given by Elisa van Jorden Forge to apply to them. We should see them as being stateless. A legal status that their children and their wives inherit under German citizenship law. So if you're confused a little bit about their legal status, don't worry, because local authorities at the time were entirely confused about their legal status. And we can see that here in the identity papers of two Cameroonian men. On the left, we have the papers of Gottlieb Kala Kinga, and it quite simply says, under status, unbekannt, unknown. That's 1923. In 1928, on the papers of Josef Bohola, it simply confirms the fact that he is staatenlos, stateless. But even these identity papers that they have are taken away from them by various local authorities from 1933 onwards. Now they're replaced with one of these, the Fremdenpass, the alien's passport. You can see here the alien's passport for the Berlin-born Theodor Voya Michael, born in Berlin in 1925, a truly remarkable man who I was very fortunate to get to know. Theodor's father, he came from Limbe, which was a city in Germany's former colony of Cameroon. Post-World War I, it's under British Mandate rule. Theodor's father attempts to return to Cameroon, but he is not allowed to do so because of the fact that he has a white wife and family. So instead, his children are stuck in Germany. On Theodor's papers, and on all the Fremdenpass, aliens' passports, it explicitly states that the holder does not possess German citizenship. And here they define Theodor firstly as being stateless, and secondly, under distinguishing marks, as being a racial alien. You can see they use a crass racial descriptor to describe him. In Nazi Germany, this is clearly a dangerous position to hold. Not only does it impact on your ability to travel, to find work or accommodation, but more importantly, it meant that those from the former colonies, their children like Theodor and their white wives, have no legal protection from a state which chose to view Black people not only as non-citizens, but moreover as racial aliens. There is no legal protection from the regime. These papers had to be renewed regularly, which means you're always coming into confrontation with the bureaucratic system and with local police. If you don't have valid up-to-date papers, you're liable to face a fine and eventually imprisonment. Already in 1934, the Togolese man Kwasi Bruce said of the alien's passport, "It's like a neurasthenia. It's not going to kill you, but it won't let you live." So this legal status is a really important aspect to the lives, particularly of former German colonial subjects. It's also worth adding that after the outbreak of World War II, even those Black residents who had a form of citizenship, Liberians, African Americans, British colonial subjects, this is not going to offer them any protection against Nazi violence. So as the Nazis quickly sought to consolidate their hold on power within the first couple of years, we have a mixture of popular racial intolerance, encouraged by the regime, combined with legal measures applied to a variety of sections of the population, which greatly impacts on the day-to-day lives of Germany's Black population. All of this will be accelerated by perhaps the most significant piece of legislation pertaining to Black people, and that's the 1935 Nuremberg race laws. Now, I suspect most of you are familiar with the race laws. First and foremost, these targeted Germany's Jewish populations. But within a week of being brought in, the Nazi Minister of the Interior, this man here, Wilhelm Frick, a man who's long since shown an unhealthy interest in Germany's Black population, he extends aspects of them to explicitly cover all Black people and their children, as well as the Sinti and Roma. What this means is that now marriages between men and women of African heritage, white Europeans, which are capable of producing children, are to be prohibited. A race mixing is an anathema to the Nazis' vision of their so-called people's community. And the aim of the laws was to protect the imagined German race from potential pollution by alien blood. In this case, through preventing the birth of Black European children. And in particular, this will impact upon the German-born children of these men from the former colonies who are coming of age in the 1930s and are likely to seek sexual partners. The timing of the extension to cover Black people in this year of 1935 is important because we now also need to turn back to the Rhineland children. Months before the passing of the race laws, Frick's ministry called a secret meeting of Nazi departments. There it was decided to carry out the sterilization of the Rhineland children. They were entering puberty. The Nazis feared that they too would soon be sexually active and might have children of their own. Sterilization was seen as being cost-effective and efficient. And so the illegal and secret sterilization of around 400 of these youngsters followed on Hitler and Frick's orders in 1937. In 1935, when the meeting takes place, out of concerns about repercussions abroad, so foreign policy interests, the systematic sterilization of the German-born children of former colonial subjects and other so-called alien races is ruled out for the moment. But by extending the Nuremberg race laws to include all Black people, the Nazis looked to achieve the same outcome, namely to prohibit the growth of future generations of Black Germans, a policy which is genocidal, at least in its intention. So what did this mean? Mixed couples who wished to marry required permission to do so. They needed to visit a health registrar. There would be a series of interviews. There'd be highly invasive physical examinations to determine the applicant's ancestry and the degree of so-called alien blood. After this, permission would be invariably denied to Black residents. Marriage becomes practically impossible. But the ways in which the race laws were applied to them at a local level clearly exceeded the remit of simply preventing marriages. That's all the law says. It prohibits marriages, nothing more. After November 1935, and particularly after the outbreak of World War II, engaging in or being accused of engaging in sexual or even romantic relationships with white Europeans was extremely dangerous for Black men, women, and youngsters and their white partner. We can see this partly by taking the case of the lady we can see in front of us. This is the marriage application begun in 1938 by Maria Tomaszek. He was born in Tabora in Tanzania, German East Africa, in 1902 to a Tanzanian mother and an Austrian father. Maria was one of almost 24 Black residents, known to have attempted to marry their white partners after the passing of the race laws. Some did so quite simply in ignorance of the fact that the laws applied to them. Others, like Maria, hoped to persuade the authorities that they be granted an exemption on account of personal circumstances. So in Maria's case, by the late 1930s, she and her white German partner, Hans Nitschke, they'd been together for several years and they had a young son. Nitschke had been called up to the Wehrmacht and the couple wanted to legalize their relationship. So they start the process of applying for permission to do so. In 1939, the application was refused by the health registrar in Berlin, who concluded that on account of the presence of alien blood, Maria would be permanently ineligible to marry. Now comes the interesting bit. So following a negative decision from a health registrar, the criminal police and or the Gestapo were typically informed that this partnership existed. They then act in the spirit of the race laws and took steps to actively end these partnerships. In Maria's case, although she and Hans are effectively separated during this period of service, the policing forces will pursue her. In 1942, she's arrested by the Gestapo as a political prisoner, and she's taken to the state police hospital in Berlin, where she is sterilized on eugenic grounds. Less than a year later, what was a healthy woman dies of tuberculosis in the Dr. Heim Hospital in Berlin-Buch, where death rates were notoriously high and countless patients were likely murdered by deliberate neglect. While she's in the state police hospital in Berlin, Maria shares a room with the 33-year-old daughter of a German woman and a Cameroonian man. This woman, too, had recently, unsuccessfully, applied to marry her white German partner, who'd also been called up to fight. She was also sterilized on eugenic grounds. In Hamburg in 1941, KHD, a grandson of a Cameroonian man, is similarly sterilized within months of applying to marry. Marriage is rejected, and he was warned that he must separate from his partner and 3 children or face yet further consequences. All 3 are among several Black Germans who face sterilization, some incarceration, or threats of violent punishment simply because they wanted to marry. But just to see how the Gestapo and the criminal police act in the spirit of the laws, it's not simply marriage applications that bring Black European couples to the attention of the authorities. A whole range of welfare, youth, and educational agencies are involved in effectively policing the population, passing on information to the likes of the Gestapo. One of the things that they would note would be the impending birth of a child, and that could really be calamitous for mixed couples. So in Vienna, after the Nazi annexation of Austria, AK, who's the son of a Cameroonian performer and his white German partner, they'll come to the attention of the local policing forces. By the end of 1942, his relationship with his Austrian partner has become visible. She is pregnant. He's sterilized at the Steinhof Psychiatric Hospital in 1943, 3 months before his partner gave birth. AK is informed by Richard Gunther, who's the head of the Hereditary and Racial Welfare Office within the Central Health Department, that, and I quote, "In Germany's Third Reich, the reproduction of unworthy," and here he uses a really crass racial slur, "will no longer be tolerated." In Hanover, a similar fate befell EN, also the son of a Cameroonian man and a German woman. The local welfare office reports EN to the Gestapo once it becomes aware that he was expecting a child with his German partner. September of 1944, EN is sterilized on eugenic grounds. This phrase eugenic grounds comes on a number of the medical records. That appears to be trying to give a cloak of legality, because the 1933 sterilization law in no ways would allow individuals to be sterilized on the basis of their race. So this eugenic grounds comes up frequently, but there's no evidence that there was any hereditary health court to look into the relationships, or indeed that there was any policy that covers this. Ian's sister is also sterilized after she and her white German partner are denied the right to marry. In several further cases, young teenage Black Germans are forewarned by policing authorities. So when they're young teenagers, they're warned against having white girlfriends. And there's evidence that white women who were seen in their company would be hauled in front of the Gestapo. But the older generation is also under pressure now. Those who'd married long prior to the Nazi takeover are equally exposed to harassment by the regime. The white partner is likely to be bullied, pressurized through threatening appeals, informal and more formal, are made to their racial consciousness. So from 1937 onwards, Emily Dieck, wife of Mandenga Dieck, was regularly ordered to the Nazi Office of Racial Policy in Danzig, urged to leave her husband. She later stated that the stress, the harassment she and her family were subjected to led to her suffering a heart attack in 1939. In 1937, the 60-year-old Tobelizman Bonifatius Foley in Berlin was subjected to harassment because of his mixed marriage. He unsuccessfully attempted to return to Togo. Even less fortunate, though, were the parents of EN in Hanover. They were simply forced to separate by local officials in May of 1937. There was no choice. Others lost their jobs or were denied employment, and at least one white partner was sterilized as a consequence of her mixed marriage, while another was incarcerated. Not surprisingly, several marriages fell apart because of the pressure mixed couples faced. Now, most of these examples come from the period after the outbreak of World War II, and I think that is significant. Because up to 1939, the summer of 1940, to a degree, the Nazis' anti-Black policies were kept in check by lingering German hopes of regaining the lost African colonies. This could insulate Black residents from the extremes of Nazi racial ideology. So Nazi colonial revisionism opens up temporary safe spaces for individuals and families. The Foreign Office in particular hopes that these men and women can be utilized for propaganda purposes in Germany and in any future German African empire. It wants to avoid negative publicity in the international press should they be mistreated. So, for example, colonial supporters within the German state and Nazi party organs, including Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, will give their blessing to what you can see here on the left. This is an image of the Deutsche Afrika-Show, the German Africa Show, kind of touring human zoo cum circus, which provided performers with the means of living, but also protection for the duration of its existence. Quite a demoralizing experience to be part of it. Among other things, the Nazis would use the show to publicly promote the colonial cause. A lot would be made of war veterans within the group who would recount their personal stories, who were presented as loyal Askaris, African soldiers who fought for the German cause in Africa, and who could speak for the benevolence of German colonial rule. Of course, at the same time, the show is a means of isolating and keeping under observation those involved. Equally, in the early 1940s, the propaganda ministry supported several colonial feature films featuring Black performers, glorifying, romanticizing German colonial history, such as the film Karl Peters from 1941. This retells the history of the notorious actions of the German colonizer Peters in East Africa. And the picture on the right is from the set of the film. It shows several Black German women enjoying a break between takes. Werner Egiomi, a son of a Cameroon man who appeared in such films, later remarked, "In the studio, you were safe. Outside of the door, you could be arrested, but inside, you were as safe as in a bank." So like the Africa Show, these films offered temporary protection from the outside world. And in at least one post-war compensation case, they were seen as evidence to suggest that Black people had not been persecuted by the Nazis. But such spaces were only temporary. They were entirely dependent on the whims of the Nazi leadership as well as popular racial prejudice. By late 1939, early 1940, the Africa Show had been shut down. Black performers were being issued with performance bans as a means of excluding them from the public space. And this had the knock-on effect of removing their one final means of making a livelihood in Nazi Germany. The closure of the Africa Show, I think, needs to be seen in this context of the outbreak of World War II. This signals the start of an escalation of violence towards these deemed to be racial aliens. In the case of Black people, we can see this in the massacres of French African troops carried out by the German army and the SS on French soil in June of 1940. And of course, the execution, imprisonment, mistreatment of African and later also African-American POWs will continue throughout the war. In this wartime context, colonial revisionism loses its urgency. So Black residents, regardless as to where they're from, who come into conflict with the law, are much more likely to face draconian punishments and internment. Unfortunately, the archival record on the Black experience of this crucial period, 40 to 45, is pretty fragmentary. And that's thanks partly to the Nazis' willful destruction of evidence. It is clear, however, that increasing numbers are being incarcerated in concentration camps, in forced labor camps, in sanatoriums, and that multiple adults, as well as Black German youngsters, are being murdered or sterilized. And there are hints that a similar pattern is happening in Austria under Nazi rule. This now also includes Black men and women who lived in other parts of Nazis-occupied Europe. And as Nazi policy towards Europe's Jews and Sinti and Roma become increasingly unrestrained, there are hints that plans are being made within the upper echelons of the regime to assimilate Black people into the Nazis' murderous racial policies. There's an order issued in October of 1942 by Heinrich Himmler, SS Reichsführer and chief of the German police. Himmler wants the statistical registration of all Black people living not just in Germany, but in occupied Europe. That information is to be sent to Alta Neba in Department 5 of the police. It bears kind of a reminiscence to the similar process of registration that he initiates against the Sinti and Roma in 1938, which will lead to Himmler's fateful decision of late 42 to deport most Sinti and Roma to the death camp Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, in the case of Black residents, the impact of Himmler's order is largely unknown. I will certainly say there is no systematic internment, but the violence that's being perpetrated at a local level clearly is increasing, and many Black residents are actively in hiding. We can see the way in which simply now being Black can become a means of being incarcerated. This incredible image here is a concentration camp record of Gerd Schramm, a young 15-year-old man, son of an African-American and a white German mother, who was sent to Buchenwald in July 1944. What's interesting for me are the reasons given for his arrest. On the card it says political, but right next to that, they use a racial descriptor as a key reason for his arrest, and that's the fact of being Black. We see this on a couple of other concentration camp records as well. By Schramm's own account, he was told by the Gestapo that his internment was on the grounds of the Nuremberg race laws. The fact that he, such, was now a racial alien and a threat to German society. So when the Nazi regime collapses in 1945, Germany's small Black population is greatly depleted, although many residents actually survived the Third Reich. This, however, tells very little of the devastating impact that Nazi rule had on their lives. Throughout the entire period, their experiences are variable, but no one is left untouched by Nazi rule. Under the Nazis, the lives of the resident population was always shaped by a system of increasing scrutiny and ever-tightening control enforced by the dictatorship, and by the fact that as racial aliens, Black people were presumed to be outside of any such rule of law as remained. There is no legal protection for them. This means that aspects of a normal life, education, work, accommodation, travel, relationships, they are rendered unstable, and in many cases, quite simply denied to them. Through their policy of sterilization and the forced breakup of couples, the Nazis had attempted to end any Black German future. They were not successful. A fact that these various images of Black Germans in later life, as well as their children and grandchildren, testifies to. But not surprisingly, the shadow of the Nazi experience continued to hang over the lives of many who did survive. Quite a number of Black Germans chose to leave Germany. They sought to rebuild lives elsewhere. Many Black German women particularly headed to the United States. And they frequently kept stories of their sufferings to themselves, just as indeed many victims did. In Germany, some white wives of Black men who died pre-1945, the wives seek to end their statelessness and regain their German citizenship for themselves, for their children, and in some cases also their grandchildren. An often complex and quite laborious process, which came too late for at least one woman who died before a final decision on her citizenship was ever made. Other mixed couples will reunite and will get married, free from the fear of Nazi intervention. Dozens of Black men, their wives, and their children also sought compensation from the West German government for their sufferings. Although it's fair to say, many did not. A series of compensation laws were introduced in West Germany. They established the principle that compensation could be paid to individuals who had suffered persecution or abuse on political, religious, or racial grounds. Claims could be made on the basis of long-term damage to health, imprisonment, death of family members, loss of property, or reduction of income, or reduction in employment opportunities, including the interruption of education. Now, for Black applicants, it was quite obvious to them they had been victims of Nazi racial persecution, and they often pointed to the Nuremberg race laws as a key turning point. Gaining acknowledgement of this traumatic experience that they endured was clearly important. It seemed obvious, too, to the Jewish and victim support groups which backed their claims that these men, women, and children were victims. It was, however, less obvious to claims officials, who seemed to have forgotten that Germany ever had an empire, who couldn't understand who these people were and what they'd been doing in Nazi Germany. Officials who had no understanding of the finer details of Nazi racial policy, who didn't even bother to look at Frick's extension of the race laws. So the success of their claims frequently depended on whether the official could imagine a scenario in which being Black could have led to persecution by the Nazis, and whether the official was in any way empathetic. Consequently, only around half of those who sought compensation were recognized individually as victims of the Nazi state. But there was certainly no recognition that as a group, Black people had actively been targeted by Nazi policies and practices. I began the paper, my title, with a question mark, questioning whether Black people were victims of the Nazi regime, both in terms of lived experiences over the period 33 to 45, and in legal terms. Under the definitions of victimhood in the post-war compensation laws, I think there's no doubt that this was the case. But already in the immediate post-45 period, we can see the beginning of a process of forgetting, which, despite the groundbreaking work of the likes of Black German activists and academics since the 90s, like Katharina Auckentheuer, Paulette Reed Anderson, this forgetting still holds. Victims whose stories were not heard by the authorities, and so who consequently stopped telling them. The small numbers involved, making it difficult to find anything other than individual recognition of suffering. The scale of the Nazi atrocities, and a lack of public knowledge about the workings of Nazi racial policy, and in the background, an onset of a process which would impact on many European states, colonial amnesia or aphasia, leading to a disremembering that Germany ever had a Black resident population, which largely stemmed from its colonies. Thank you.
Dr. Aitken, thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. Before we turn to the questions that we've compiled from the audience and then open it up for more if we have time, I wanted to ask one question. As you know, the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh does a lot of remembrance work with both survivors and descendants, which also addresses the reckoning of what happened to them, us, and our communities, and the intergenerational trauma that results from that. And I was curious what you've learned about how the Black German community with this history, especially given the fact that it's almost unknown.
Yeah, I think I can probably speak to that on two levels. Partly, I can speak about the families who I've worked with. In many cases, when I've either contacted them or they've contacted me through seeing my research, that generation of Black people who were born in Germany and those who came after the Holocaust period knew very little about their parents' or grandparents' experiences. Those stories were not really passed on. That German time period was completely kind of blocked out of the personal histories. Particularly, I can think of some of those families, ladies who went to the United States after 1945 and formed families there, who tried to avoid speaking German, who, completely stopped talking about their experiences. And I think we can see that partly in Germany itself as a consequence of the reactions of the claims authorities. Because as I said in the paper, Black Germans claimed their victimhood. They wanted recognition of that, but they did not get that recognition. So we can see a slow process of them then stopping to testify about what they'd experienced because people were not willing to listen. I think in Germany itself, for current day Black Germans, there's a real sense of their history having been erased, of these real blank spots within this longer history of a Black German presence, continually having to explain who they are, where they came from, how they fit into German society. So it's a trauma that's felt on multiple levels. I really wanted to start with the Stolperstein. Stolperstein only mean, they're only small things. It's only a small way to try and start remembrance, but you need to start somewhere. And I was really surprised at how few Stolpersteine there were and how difficult it was at times to try and get the Stolperstein and the recognition and get people interested in coming along to hear about these stories. Within the Black German community, there was a lot of interest. Within majority white society, I would say there was less interest.
Thank you. So we have a series of questions that we've received. The first one is from Silu. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. The question is, post-World War I, Britain tried to break up mixed-race families by expelling Black men, leaving their white wives and mixed-race children. Why did the Nazis, who initially encouraged Jews to leave Germany, not encourage Black men and their families to leave, but instead forbade them to leave?
Yeah, I think that's a good question with a complex answer. I think during the Weimar period, there were plans to try and pressurize individual former colonial subjects to leave. The Foreign Office was interested in that as a potential. The problem was, who was going to take them? Because the Mandate state authorities, the French and the British, quite simply did not want to take them. They didn't want these people to return. And it was complicated, should they have a white wife and children? Because the Germans still had this kind of vague hopes and expectations of gaining at least one, maybe two of the colonies back. And what they certainly did not want would be mixed families in those colonial territories. They had a long history of trying to prevent colonial mixed marriages pre-1914 in their empire. The Nazis very vaguely discussed opportunities of potentially trying to move Black Germans somewhere else, but that really didn't come to any kind of fruition. There was difficulties with legalities, there's difficulties with the financing, there's difficulties with who is going to take responsibility for them. So this never really got beyond a couple of very brief exchanges within departments as to what they could possibly do. I think also within the Nazi period, there are clearly some people within the Foreign Office that think that these Black German men can propagate German colonialism. They can come out and say how benevolent the Germans were. This is what the Africa show becomes around about 37, 38, when the Nazis really controlled the show. Getting Black men to step out in front of white Germans and say Germans were great colonizing. They were great to us. It's the French, the British, they're the people who are terrible colonizers. So I think there's all sorts of complex reasons. Some are foreign policy related, some are to do with views of mixed families in general and ideas of racial hierarchies, particularly within colonial environment. I hope that partly answers the question.
Thanks. So we have two questions about relationships between Black Germans and other groups within and outside of Germany. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to read you both questions and you can hopefully answer them together. The Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center asks, I'm curious as to the relationship and response between other implicated groups and the Afro-Germans. I've followed Ben Ratzkoff's work, for instance, on Black reactions to Nazism in real time, and I'm curious if this came up as a concern, a cause for coalition, or a cause for competition among the Jewish, Roma, et cetera, communities within and outside of it. And then within Germany and outside of it. I apologize. Then Michelle asks, was there a sense of solidarity between the Black community in Germany at the time, especially before Nazi rule, and the Black communities in other European countries?
Those are great questions. Let me go to the first one. They're quite difficult to answer, partly because it's very difficult to find the voice of Black Germans. A lot of the documents that you find are written from the perspective of officials in health ministries and colonial offices, etc. So it's quite difficult to actually find what Black Germans themselves are thinking. What is notable is, though, that a lot of Black Germans marry Jewish Germans. And I have speculated and wondered whether this might be because, as outsider groups, often you see Black Germans in the performance environment, as indeed we see a number of Jewish Germans within the performance environment, that this then brings them together. There are minor aspects of solidarity you can see when individuals take action. So I stumbled across quite a remarkable case file from the Gestapo in Frankfurt in 1938, who were interested in this Cameroonian boxer who was being investigated for tax fraud. But when they knocked on his door, they found something quite more remarkable, because in 1938, he had effectively opened up his boxing club for dance evenings for Jews, so that there was a place that they could gather. And needless to say, the Gestapo were really quite amazed by this and quite worried by this, so they closed it down quite quickly. I can't tell you exactly what happened, but the next time this Cameroonian man appears in the files, he's now living in Paris 6 months later, so I suspect that he and his wife fled. We can see smaller aspects of solidarity at times. AK, I mentioned very briefly, who was sterilized. He was involved actively in a resistance movement of Jews of mixed heritage that was run in Vienna. And he was part of that, playing a minor role. And he will be picked up and he will be incarcerated partly for that. But the leader of this group in Vienna, Otto Horn, will write a testimony in his behalf when he's applying for compensation post-1945. So we see minor activities, I think, and clearly aspects of solidarity. I would say that the Black German resident communities that I know of knew what was happening to the Rhineland children as well, because some of those Black Germans will flee once they realize what's happening to the Rhineland children. They know that this is going to be coming to them soon. In terms of solidarity to other parts of Europe and the United States, this becomes increasingly difficult after 1933. We can clearly see solidarity between African Americans and Black Germans in the Weimar period. I'm not sure that African Americans always really understood the situation of Black Germans, but we can see African American newspapers discussing their lives in a kind of inspirational and aspirational manner. But I think a lot of African Americans kind of felt that this is not the Jim Crow South that you're experiencing, but they're not living in Germany day to day. So I think there's solidarity, but at a kind of geographical disconnect. There's more solidarity maybe from populations in Paris, because once France takes over Cameroon, this next generation of Cameroonians who go to Europe are going to France and not Germany. And this includes family members. This includes kinship ties. So we see Africans in France raising concerns about the statelessness of Black Germans. But these ties are, political activism is effectively, it's over in 1933. The Nazis closed down Black German political groups and organizations. So it's much more difficult to try and sustain these ties.
Great. So Jake Newsom is asking you this next question. Have you happened to come across any stories of LGBTQ plus Black Germans in your research?
I've been asked that question a number of times. The straight answer is no, although there are hints on the margins of some of the sources that actually there was at least one Cameroonian man who I think probably was homosexual, who was living he left Germany and went to Paris, and was living in Paris in the 1930s, and who was involved in the kind of club and nightlife scene, and who eventually will be incarcerated, and he dies in a French camp. It's very, very difficult to find that kind of information, unfortunately. But that is the only case that I can think of where there are indications that he probably was homosexual, and that this and the fact of his blackness are the two things that leads to his victimization.
Okay, again, I'm going to pair two questions that deal with getting more specific about evidence of Nazi policies and perspectives towards Black Germans. Irina Livesinu of University of Pittsburgh asks, how much did anti-Black racist policies appear in Nazi discourse, and not to the extent of anti-Semitic rhetoric? And Dr. Barbara Burston asks, was there any evidence that Hitler or his henchmen gave orders to finally eliminate the Black population in their midst?
To the second question, no. No. The Nazis, as I'm sure many people know, they destroy a lot of the information, the documents. They obscure people's fates on death records. That is one of the issues we have with trying to work out what happened to a lot of Black people. There are quite a few Black people die between 1942 and 45, and you see in the death certificates it's a heart attack or it's tuberculosis. That makes me automatically suspicious, but it's very difficult to try and move beyond that. So evidence of Hitler looking for some kind of final solution for Black people, no, but we do know that he did give the order for the Rhineland children to be sterilized in 1937. There is documentation of that was found by a German researcher a couple of years ago. I completely forgot what the first question was. It was about rhetoric, and yeah, rhetoric and language and visibility. I think a lot of it relates to the Rhineland children. A lot of newspaper articles around about 1936, 35, 36 have features on the Rhineland children, visibly identifying them in local newspapers, but also in national Nazi publications as being racially different, and making quite clear that they are not part of the people's community. So I think that's where we can absolutely see it. When the race laws come out, I was kind of looking for traces of, does anyone pick up on the fact at the time that this is also being related to Black people? And actually they do. Local newspapers and district newspapers and national newspapers are also bringing out Frick's extension and making it publicly known that Black people, Sinti and Roma, are no longer allowed to marry so-called Aryans. Globke and Stuckart, in their semi-official commentary on the race laws, also underlined this fact. There are a lot of racial experts, racial hygienists who are also mentioning Black people when they talk about race. Clearly, they're not at the forefront of Nazi racial policies, but there are often, in a number of these publications, mentions of the Black population as well as being outside of the people's community. So for those claims officials post-1945 who say they can't find any evidence of Nazi racial policy or Nazi racial thinking towards Black people, all they would have needed to do was to go back and look at a lot of the Nazi publications.
Okay, Debbie Stuber asks, how many Black people in total were murdered by the Nazis? And do you know if any of the Cameroonians who returned to their homeland ended up being murdered during the, I'm assuming because I know Debbie well, the Bamileke genocide in Cameroon?
So the first, yeah, I mean, the first question I can't answer simply because we do not know how many Black people lived in Germany at the time. I'm telling you it's maybe 2,500 to 3,000. There might have been more. One of the problems of tracing individuals of African heritage is if the mother and father didn't die and a child took on the mother's name, they become almost untraceable. So the archival documentation allows us to come up with a list of many of the Cameroonian men, Togolese men, East African men. If children take on their names, then we can find the children. If the children take on the wife's name, it's almost impossible to find them. It's like a needle in a haystack in many ways. So to say how many people died, I can't tell you. I can certainly say that several dozen of the Black residents were incarcerated. At least a couple of dozen, maybe 2 dozen, were actively sterilized. Others were sought for sterilization and simply went into hiding. When Himmler's order is presented at the end of 1942, people are at that time in hiding. And a lot of the local police forces quite simply can't find them. So they're not passing on information. So to come up with numbers and percentages, I don't really want to do, because partly I don't think this is a story about numbers and percentages. How many people does it become necessary for this to become a story, to show intent or to say that there are common experiences? I would certainly say that all Black people who lived in Germany were affected by the Nazi rule of law. At the very least, children would not have been allowed to finish their education. At the very least, people would have lost their jobs. In the worst case scenarios, in certain locations, particularly Wiesbaden, Frankfurt seems to be quite a hot spot. People lost their lives and were actively sterilized. So it's impossible, I think, to talk about numbers at the moment in terms of the archival resources we have. I did hint that there's signs that some of these things are happening in Austria as well. I have a PhD student who I saw who's on here. I'm not going to ask her to speak, don't worry, Michelle. But she has also found traces of youngsters being examined in 1942, this kind of critical hotspot when we're seeing sterilizations taking place, and we know that at least 1 or 2 of these individuals were sterilized. In terms of Cameroonians who went back, whether they were connected to the Bamileke genocide, I would suspect that's probably not the case, because the vast majority of Cameroonians who come pre-1914. It's almost impossible to get to Germany after 1914 from Africa. And the vast majority come from the Douala population group. This is the kind of the cultural, political, economic elite who for a long time have sent children to be educated in Europe. So they've sent children to Britain in the 1800s. When Germany becomes the colonial power, they just send their children to Germany. There are Cameroonians from other parts of Cameroon who get to Germany, but I haven't seen any indication of any Bamileke. And most, so I don't think that would be the case.
Okay, so the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center asks, can you also talk about how Allied occupation after the war influenced the racial discourse, especially with regard to American racial policy, which likely had less to say about Jews and Roma than Black individuals? And that question in the chat got a lot of little thumbs up.
I think what I would say on that front is that we have now a new generation of Black Germans. These are the children of the liberation who are born to African American soldiers. I think we see in the press and certainly in any political discourse, the people that I focus my research on, they're of no interest to the West German government. They have literally, they're becoming forgotten. Whereas the occupation children, the children of liberation, they become at the forefront of a new racial discourse. Is it possible to be Black and to be German? And I think in a lot of ways that discussion develops, ultimately, the answer that the West German authorities and many of those who are involved, educationalists, social workers, the conclusion they reach is it's not possible. And that these children of the liberation become increasingly marginalized within West German society. So I do think you can see some of the aspects of a racial hierarchy in the United States, white, Black, now translating into what's happening in West Germany.
Debbie O'Neill has asked, are there any efforts that you are aware of to integrate information on the Black German population into history textbooks that are used in high schools today?
I wish there were. I wish there were. One of the reasons I created a small exhibition was partly because I wanted to go to Cameroon and take some of my research there. The exhibition is really visual, but I wanted to engage with schools, particularly in the UK, partly because I know Black British history isn't taught in schools. The British Empire is celebrated and not critically looked at. So I hoped, because German history is very big in Britain and in British schools, this might be another way of challenging young people's ideas, partly about German history, but also about who Europeans are and can be. And to see that there are also Black populations that don't speak English, but might have a different language. I am not aware, however, of any attempts in Britain, in Germany, anywhere else to integrate this really in a consistent and at a state level, or even at a district level, into schools. It's often reliant on individual teachers who are enthusiastic about the topic, or who themselves might be Black German, or community activists who are doing this work. And in fact, I'd say in general, a lot of the really good work on Black German history is not being done within academia. It's been done outside because of a lack of institutional academic support for it.
So Jake Newsom asks, I'm always curious about what draws a researcher to a topic. Can you talk to us about what motivated you to do this research? It's a great question.
Oof, I'll try and give you the short answer and not the long answer. So I come from Scotland, and at school in Scotland, we learned either English history, so kind of the 1832 Great Reform Act, which I found pretty boring, or we looked at Weimar Germany, which I found pretty exciting. So when I went to university, I studied a lot of German history. I wanted to do a PhD. My supervisor, two things happened. She found police records about a communist event in 1930, which said there was a Cameroonian speaker. She was like, wow, go find out more. At the same time, she gave me a book by a lady called Katharina Ockenteuer. And this book was called Eine Afrodeutsche Geschichte, Black German History. I could not read German. So I would be hours long in the library with Katharina's book on the one hand and the dictionary on the other hand, trying to puzzle out what her book was about. And effectively, it was one of the first real efforts, I think, to recover this Black German history. She takes the biographical story of one family who actually saw in the presentation, the Dieck family. And I read this and I just thought, wow, I have been looking at German history for the best part of 9 years, and here is a story I have never heard of. This is a completely different history. So in many ways, I was blessed by reading her book and following her footnotes to see what she had been able to find out at the time. And by the time I managed to get around, I was living in Berlin. So I was literally just going into the archive every second day to see what I could find. And I found more and more and more. And it became clear to me that here was a massive story that is not just German history, it's European history, it's colonial history, it's a history of anti-colonial resistance, it's a history of the Communist International, it's a history of German culture, it's a history of multiple African states. And I was so fortunate to be able to work in that field and continue to be able to work in the field.
I have one question that I'm not needing you to answer now, but I'm wondering if we could get a list of books or resources that are academic and not, that if people are interested, that we could send out to the attendees. I know when you were mentioning that there's a lot of non-academic writing that's being done. I've watched some of your presentations. I know you've presented with people that have done a lot of personal writing from their experience. So is that something that we could
Yeah,
share?
absolutely. YouTube in some ways is a gift because there's quite a lot of personal testimonies you can see, including of Tiarovoya Michael, who was quite simply the most charismatic and engaging person I ever met on the course and the journey of this research. So absolutely. This is partly what frustrates me about schools and the educational system, because there are so many resources out there. It is absolutely possible to teach and engage young people in this history.
Well, with that, I think we are at the end. I really appreciate this. We have tons of comments talking about how interesting this presentation was, and how much people appreciate you sharing your expertise. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and especially you, Robbie, for sharing your research with us today. And
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.